All right. Remember that the best way to study is to take practice tests. And if you can't find good practice tests, build your own and learn while you do it using the Learn My Test tool. Check out our a practice test that I made using Learn My Test by clicking on the link in the description. So I want to give Ciccarelli and White some credit for their book, Psychology and Exploration, 4th edition. This book was used to make some of the videos. So let's jump in. So last week, I gave you a lot of information on research methods, and I think you do need to know that information, a lot of it, to be able to digest your article. So that's why. But this week is a lot shorter. So basically, what we're going to do this week is just give you a basic understanding of all the different perspectives in psychology and go over them very briefly, just so you have a working knowledge of them. And we won't cover all of them in this class. We'll go into a lot of detail in some of them, and so, but I just want you to have a working knowledge of them when you leave the course of some of the other ones. So that is what we'll do. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump forward into um, what is psychology. So psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. And I think that is a pretty solid definition of psychology. So let's jump in and talk about what is behavior. So behavior is like, I'm going to talk really loud right now, and that's behavior because I'm doing something and you can hear me doing it. And the people on YouTube are probably really hating me right now because I'm talking really loud, and they're probably like, "Oh, I need earmuffs." And so, uh, and so that is, an example of behavior. So anything that you're doing that other people can see is behavior. If other people can't see it, it's not behavior. So the other side of psychology is mental processes. So things like memory and thoughts and feelings and those type of things go on inside our heads, and they're not always seen, right? We can act some of them out, but they're not always seen. So that is an example. So that's the other piece of psychology. Sometimes we act out our thoughts, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we think something and we're like, man, I shouldn't say that. Like if you're eating someone makes you dinner and it tastes like crap, you're not gonna, if you don't know them, you're probably gonna be like, this tastes like crap, but you're not gonna say it to them, right? So that does happen sometimes, right? So we're going to talk about some really important people. So psychology already started with Wilhelm Wundt. Some people call him the father of psychology, although other people call William James the father of psychology. So they have the battle for who is the daddy of psychology. But one of the big things for Wilhelm Wundt is he started this idea called introspection, which means basically asking people what their experience is like. So he would have people do different things like holding a rock, like throwing a ball, like picking up a book. And he would ask them, like, what is that experience like for you? What is it like doing that? And so that's the idea of introspection. So that's the methodology that Wundt decided to study psychology. And he had a student that's really important too, named Edward Tishner. And so Edward Tishner had this idea called structuralism. And his whole idea was, let's use this idea of introspection in order to come up with ways to understand psychology or ways to understand the mind, like the categories of things that we want to talk about when we talk about how the brain works. And so that's the idea. He was trying to come up with these categories of things to discuss the conscious experience or to break it down. So I would say that they were probably trying to come up with those things that I just mentioned to you: thoughts, feelings, behaviors. And reactions, memory, and those types. That's what Wundt and Tishner were trying to come up with. They were trying to say these are the different things that you need to study psychology, or these are the different categories of breaking down the conscious experience. So then they had this guy named William James, who, like I said, is also sometimes referred to as the father of psychology. And William James came up with this idea called functionalism. And he said, I like Wundt's idea of introspection, but I think it's more about how all these things relate to each other, right? How these different processes connect with each other, like to make your conscious experience and to make what you do throughout the day. So how do thoughts, feelings, and behaviors come together? How do they work together in order to produce a whole conscious experience, right? So you may do something like you may drink, a cup of water, and that's behavior, and the drinking the cup of water may make you feel positive because you were thirsty, and so that makes you feel positive, and then feeling positive makes you more likely to behave in this way or remember certain things. So William James wanted to know, like, what are the connections between all the things? How do all these parts work together? um so that's functionalism. Like, how does everything you know work together? And he's getting into the idea of evolutionary psychology. So we're going to jump ahead to this dude name, or not a dude, but this principle called Gestalt psychology. And so Gestalt psychology is this idea that perception, so what you perceive in the environment, um, is can be broken down into smaller parts and easily understood. And our brains have this way of putting things together. So when you try to ignore the brain putting everything together for you, and you look at the little pieces of everything, you can kind of understand how our brain works. And Gestalt psychology is super cool. So let me show you an example of Gestalt psychology. So if you look at this thing here, right, our brain naturally breaks it down for us. It has a line here of white circles. It naturally breaks it down into a line here of black circles, a separate line of white circles, a separate line of black circles, a separate line of white circles, a separate line of black circles. And so it naturally breaks it down for us, right? Um, but why don't we look at this as just a big square with 36 circles in it? Why do we look at it as a circle with white line, white line, black line? And why do we group the black lines together, or the black circles together, and not the white circles? Like, why doesn't our brain go down and say these are together, right? Because this is a line, these are all close together. Why does our brain go here? Because the black circles, all look alike. So that's why we perceive those as being together in the line. And we perceive these as being together because they're closer together than these that are further away. So our brain naturally groups things that look alike together, and we naturally group things that that are closer together as together, right? So you can think about this as a metaphor for like things like racism, right? We naturally our brains group people that look alike together, and we group people that live in a certain area. We group those people together, and that's just naturally how our brains work. But breaking it down is the idea of Gestalt psychology, trying to ignore our brain putting things together. This is another example of Gestalt psychology that's kind of cool. These are just separate lines. Why does our brain look at these as a circle and a square? Because they're not. Why doesn't it just look at it as little fragments of lines separately? It doesn't. It puts everything together. Our brain naturally does that. So looking at the each individual piece and seeing how our brain puts things together is Gestalt psychology. So we're going to talk about one of the biggest, most popular figures in psychology is Sigmund Freud. And I actually do have a video for you guys to watch on Sigmund Freud. He came up with this idea called psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis is comprised of these things called the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is like your natural impulses. It's like, whatever comes into your head, you're going to do. And then your superego is what society tells you to do. So I'm going to give an example of going to the bathroom and teaching a class. I know it's kind of a gross example, but I'll just give it to you. So if I'm up in front of a class and I'm teaching the class, and I all of a sudden have to go to the bathroom, my id is just telling me, go to the bathroom on the floor. Just pull your pants down and pee on the floor. You got to go really bad. Just go. Go right now. And my superego is going, no, you can't pee on the floor. Are you serious? Like, what's gonna happen? You could get arrested for that. You would get fired. You can't pee on the. What are you talking? You can't pee on the floor. And so my ego is kind of in the middle of all this, like mediating this and saying, And the superego is like, you can't even pee until class is over. You got to wait till the end. And then it's like, no, you got to pee right now. If you don't pee right now, you're going to die. You got to pee right now. So the ego is like mediating these two people, these two, creatures on the shoulder. And the ego's like, okay, I going to the superego, I do have to pee really bad. And the superego is like, you can't pee, you can't pee. And he's like, well, I do have to pee really bad. And then he's like, maybe I should hold it. And then it's like, no, you got to pee now. And so finally, the ego's like, okay, what I'm going to do is just give the class something to do, and then I'm going to excuse myself and go to the bathroom, because that's the most mature thing to do. That's compromising between the id and the superego. Because the id has a lot of focuses on our natural like impulses and drives. The Freud talks a lot about sex, like sex and aggression are like a core of his theories, and a lot of his theories talk about how are crazy a little bit. They talk about how boys want to have sex with their mom, and all that kind of crazy stuff. So there's a little bit of a little crazy there, but that's the basic idea of Freud's theory, that you need to know the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is your natural impulses, the ego is compromising between both, and the superego is what society tells you to do. So the next person that's really important that we will talk about in this class, so we're not going to get into Freud. Oh yeah, another thing about Freud before we go is that Freud believed in the unconscious mind. So he believed in unconscious processes. So before that, we were focused on the conscious mind, but Freud decided, no, we're going to focus on the unconscious mind, because the unconscious mind affects behavior. And there's a lot of things we do, especially like relationships with people, that we don't really understand, because a lot of it is unconscious. Like some people will tell me, my wife has a friend, and she's married now, but before this, she was like, why do I always pick guys that are really bad for me? And so she doesn't know unconsciously why she does it. And so a lot of things with the relationships are unconscious. So uh, Ivan Pavlov is a Russian biologist, and he came up with this idea called classical conditioning, where he was able to teach dogs to salivate to the sound of a bell. And so what he did was he presented the bell with a piece of meat, and the dog would salivate to the piece of meat. But eventually, he took the piece of meat away and rang the bell, and the dog started salivating to the sound of the bell. And so he came up with this idea called classical conditioning, that you can learn to associate a random neutral thing in your environment with something that you're biologically wired to want, or something that you biologically have a reaction to. So for example, like if you had a cheeseburger in front of your face, you would biologically salivate to that, unless you don't like cheeseburgers. But if you had a cheeseburger, you'd be like, whoa, that looks really good, and you would salivate to it. And now that we've associated Five Guys, some people, with cheeseburgers, when we see Five Guys, we salivate to Five Guys, because we associate the Five Guys logo with really delicious cheeseburgers. So that would be an example of classical conditioning. So that's one of the things that Ivan Pavlov came up with. And John B. Watson, he came up with this idea called operant conditioning, which operant conditioning is very simple. It's the idea that if you do something and something good happens, you're going to keep doing it. If you do something and something bad happens, you're going to not do it as much. And so Ivan Pavlov and John B. Watson together, they're both combined. So classical and operant conditioning are combined to what's called behaviorism. And behaviorism is, it doesn't focus on what we're thinking at all. It doesn't focus on emotions. It doesn't focus on subjective introspection. It's just observable behavior. I do this one thing, and then this thing, and then this person does this thing. So I give my child does his homework, I give him a reward, the child keeps doing his homework. I'm observing, it's observable behavior, things that you can see people do. No thoughts, no feelings. That's behaviorism. Okay. And it's combined Pavlov and Watson. All right. So let's jump forward. So the more modern approaches is the psychodynamic perspective. So Freud's theory is the psychoanalytic theory, and psychodynamic, basically Freud's theory, like I said, was kind of crazy, a lot of sex and kind of weird. You're attracted to your mom, and if you're a boy, and you're attracted to your dad if you're a girl, and so psychodynamic, kind of went a little away from that and said, okay, it's more about relationships with people and this idea of these things called defense mechanisms, which are sometimes we do the exact opposite of how we feel, and or we don't do what we feel because of our superego, right? So there's one called reaction formation, which is doing the exact opposite of what you feel, right? So it's like on the playground, or in real life, like a girl acts like he's not interested in a guy when really she is interested in him. That would be an example of a defense mechanism. And so psychodynamic tries to get at those, it's a therapy technique, and it tries to get at those defense mechanisms to figure out, well, if you're interested in the guy, why don't you just, communicate that to him? So that's the kind of idea of psychodynamic. It's studying relationships through the unconscious mind and looking at those defense mechanisms. So behavioralism, I just talked about that, so I'm not going to go over it again. The cognitive perspective is, in contrast to behaviorism, is the part that we don't see. So we can see people do stuff, but cognitive is your thoughts, your feelings, memory, and memory is a big part of cognitive psychology. So, but also your thoughts and feelings are also another big part of cognitive psychology. And the socio-cultural perspective is, how does your environment affect your behavior, and how does it affect your thoughts and feelings, and what is normal to you? So your culture, the type of people that you grow up with, things in one culture could be completely normal, whereas things in other cultures are not as normal, right? And there's some ideas that the type of language you speak is part of your culture, and that also affects your thoughts, because your thoughts are usually in your native language, right? So that can affect how you think and other things. So culture is a really important piece, and also just what's acceptable in your culture is going to affect how you behave and think too, right? So that's the idea of the socio-cultural perspective. And then the biopsychological perspective is simply looking at the biological processes of the mind. So your nervous system, neurons firing and sending signals, different neurotransmitters and chemicals that are being fired in your brain. And what does that mean? And how does that affect your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, right? So looking at the biological explanations for thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And that's the biopsychological perspective. And we will talk about that in our class. All right. So let's jump forward. So there's some careers in psychology. You can be a psychologist. Clinical psychologists can do counseling and therapy. In most states, you have to get a doctorate to be a clinical psychologist, but in 13 states, you can be a clinical psychologist with a master's degree. Um, so psychologists, like I said, they can do counseling and therapy. They can do psychological testing to diagnose people with different mental disorders. They can work in the legal setting, educational settings, and in, I think it's like 3 or 4 states, they can prescribe psychiatric medication. One of the biggest misconceptions is that psychologists can prescribe medication, and like I said, it's only in 3 states, and a very, very small percentage of psychologists actually prescribe medication. So most of the time, psychologists can't prescribe medication. Another type of psychologists are experimental psychologists, and they usually are professors and work at a university doing psychological research. Okay, so the only other field that we'll talk about is psychiatrists. So psychiatrists have an MD, and they can prescribe medication. So they specialize in treating psychological disorders by prescribing different types of medications. Although psychiatrists do that and specialize in that, most psychiatric medications are prescribed by primary care doctors or family doctors. Just a side note. So thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully this gives you a breakdown of the different perspectives in psychology. please, please, please check out the other videos that I posted. Um, all right. Remember, the best way to study is to take practice tests. And if you can't find good practice tests, build your own and learn while you do it using the Learn My Test study tool. It's absolutely free at learnmytest.com.